What's going on, y'all? Attorney Tom here. It's time for another USCSB React. Today's video is titled Wake Up Call Refinery Disaster in Philadelphia. Let's jump right into it.
June 21st, 2019. The Philadelphia Energy Solutions, or PES Refinery in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. A dangerously corroded pipe elbow ruptured, releasing process fluid into the refinery's hydrofluoric acid, or HF alkylation unit. The process fluid then ignited, causing a fire and series of explosions. The fire and explosions caused the release of over 5,000 pounds of highly toxic HF, launched a 38,000-pound vessel fragment off-site, and resulted in an estimated property damage loss of $750 million.
Very interesting. I'm going to get to talk about property damage loss as well. Normally in these videos, it's really just about the personal injury aspect, but because this happened in an urban area, you heard it from the narrator himself, $750 million worth of property damage. For the past 3 years, literally almost to the day, because the explosion was Thanksgiving of 2019, I've been working on a refinery explosion case that involves injuries, but also a large property damage aspect as well. So this should be an interesting video.
The Philadelphia Energy Solutions refinery was the largest oil refining complex on the East Coast and could process up to 335,000 barrels of crude oil per day. Within its hydrofluoric acid alkylation unit, the refinery produced alkylate, a high-octane blending component of gasoline. That was done by using hydrofluoric acid as a catalyst. HF is a highly toxic chemical that is particularly hazardous if a release occurs because it vaporizes, becoming airborne. Breathing HF can cause lung damage, and skin contact with HF can cause severe burns and death. On the day of the incident, the HF alkylation unit was operating normally. Shortly before 4 a.m., a board operator in the refinery's main control room performed a routine change in the configuration of the process within the unit. The operator increased the flow of process fluid in an area of the unit by a total of 7 barrels per hour. Stable operation continued, with no abnormal pressure or temperature changes in the unit as a result of these actions. But nevertheless, at 4 a.m., a severely corroded pipe elbow with...
Interesting. So you heard the narrator say there was nothing abnormal about this day's process. No abnormal pressure, no abnormal processes done by the operator, or at least the start is simply just a failure of the integrity of the system. The pipe just burst. So initially, I want to know, why did the pipe burst? How often was the pipe inspected? Obviously, if this is an elbow, maybe it is it's structurally weaker component because of the bend. When was this pipe last replaced? When was this pipe last inspected? These are things that I'm going to want to know, but knowing the USCSB, they're probably going to tell us.
Within the unit ruptured. Flammable process fluid containing mostly propane, along with a small concentration of HF, escaped through the failed pipe elbow. The leaking process fluid formed a large ground-hugging vapor cloud, about 10 feet high, that engulfed a portion of the unit. Moments later, the vapor cloud ignited, causing a massive fire. Approximately 30 seconds later, the board operator took steps to prevent the release of additional HF. This was done by rapidly draining the unit's 339,000 pounds of hydrofluoric acid to a special vessel called the Rapid Acid De-Inventory, or RAD drum.
So if any of y'all have watched my videos reacting to the USCSB before, you know I love the word foreseeable. It is foreseeable that when you have a refinery and you're dealing with flammable hydrocarbons, that incidents are going to occur. And when these incidents occur, you need to have mitigation systems in place so you don't take a bad situation and you make it worse. And that's exactly what they're doing here so far. The operator engaged this system within 30 seconds of the explosion. Additionally, in the modern world, you're not only going to want to have manual controls, but automatic controls as well, because you don't really want to have to rely on a human making these judgment calls. But again, I'm sure the USCSB will show us all of that.
The RAD drum was designed to safely hold HF in the event of an incident. At 4:15, due to the ongoing fire, an explosion erupted in the alkylation unit. 4 minutes later, a second explosion occurred. At 4:22, a process vessel in the unit containing flammable hydrocarbons violently ruptured, causing the third, largest explosion. A giant 38,000-pound fragment of the vessel flew across the Schuylkill River and landed on the river's opposite bank. Two other fragments, one weighing about 23,000 pounds and the other about 15,500 pounds, landed inside the refinery. The fire knocked out the control system communication to the refinery's HF water mitigation system, and the backup power supply to the system also failed.
That's a design problem. Again, it's foreseeable that you're going to have fires. It's foreseeable that you're going to have explosions if your water mitigation system and the power to it and the backup power to it is located in close proximity to the potential things that might blow up. That's a problem. So again, going back to the foreseeability issue, I would want to know that had the water been properly ejected and started attacking the fire, would have these subsequent explosions occurred.
As a result, the refinery's elevated HF mitigation water cannons, which were designed to spray high volumes of water to help contain an HF release, could not be turned on remotely from the control room. The water mitigation system was a critical safeguard at the refinery, designed to prevent released HF from going off-site. About 40 minutes after the release began, a refinery shift supervisor wearing bunker gear entered the unit and manually turned on a pump that allowed the HF mitigation water cannons to operate.
He manually entered the pump in order to turn the water guns on. Holy cow, how would you like to be this guy?
Gear entered the unit and manually turned on a pump that allowed the HF mitigation water cannons to operate. Other refinery workers closed valves to stop the flow of hydrocarbons and steam into the unit. The fire burned for over 24 hours until it was finally extinguished the following day at about 8:30 a.m. 5 workers sustained minor injuries during the incident and response. The CSB is unaware of anyone off-site experiencing health impacts from the hydrofluoric acid release.
Wow. Thank goodness. Only 5 minor injuries. Now, obviously, we don't know what constitute a minor injury, but thank goodness nobody died. Now, before we continue this conversation, I want to talk about the civilian injury component to this case. As the narrator said, no civilians were immediately damaged, but they were exposed to this deadly chemical for over 24 hours while the chemical was burning. I'm working on a case very, very similar to this. A refinery called the TPC refinery exploded and released a chemical called butadiene.
On Wednesday before Thanksgiving, the plant exploded several times. That triggered the evacuation of thousands of residents in Port Neches and surrounding communities. On Friday, residents were allowed to return to their homes. However, they were warned about the danger of asbestos from plant debris. Some of the chemicals that have been burning for days are known to cause cancer. So their lawyers are filing this paperwork so that these people can take TPC to court should they get sick down the road.
Individuals could develop cancer sometime in the next, whether it be 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 15 years from now. And unfortunately, once you let these chemicals out, there's no pulling them back in.
Butadiene is extremely toxic, and when you're exposed to toxic chemicals, these injuries might not manifest themselves right away. It could take a week, it could take a month, it could take years. You literally could develop cancer 20 years after the exposure because it just takes time for some problems to manifest itself when you're exposed to toxic things. Think of smoking cigarettes. You don't smoke a cigarette and then instantly get cancer or mesothelioma. You're not exposed to asbestos and then instantly develop mesothelioma. These things take time to develop potentially. So as part of the TPC litigation, the refinery that I'm working on, there was a medical monitoring component to it. So basically, you file a lawsuit, you say, hey company, you need to put aside a pool of money because the people who were affected need to have medical monitoring for the next so many years because there might not be problems today, but these problems might manifest themselves in the following months, years, decades. You get the point. Now, obviously, I don't have any background information on this refinery explosion, but I would anticipate a medical monitoring action of some sort was probably filed as well.
The CSB launched an investigation into the fire and explosions and found 5 key safety issues contributed to the severity of the incident.
5.
They are mechanical integrity, verifying safety of equipment after changes to good practice guidance.
Interesting.
Remotely operated emergency isolation valves.
Interesting.
Safeguard reliability in HF alkylation units. And inherently safer design.
Okay, interesting. I think I got 3 of the 5. Definitely the integrity of the pipe, remote isolated valves, and safety design I kind of merged together. So I'm going to give myself a 2.5 out of 5.
The first safety issue is mechanical integrity. The CSB determined that the pipe elbow that failed had corroded faster than other piping in the HF alkylation unit.
Interesting.
That is because the steel pipe elbow contained a higher content of nickel and copper than other piping in the
Interesting.
unit. Carbon steel is commonly used in HF alkylation units, but is known to be susceptible to hydrofluoric acid corrosion. In refinery processes using some amount of HF, hydrogen fluoride reacts with iron in steel piping to produce iron fluoride. The iron fluoride then forms a film that coats the inside surface of the piping and protects the steel from corrosion. However, if the steel contains high concentrations of copper, nickel, or chromium, known as residual elements, the rate of corrosion is often higher. This is because the iron fluoride film that forms on steel containing high amounts of residual elements is less protective. The pipe elbow that ruptured in the PES refinery was installed around 1973. It had originally been constructed of a particular steel alloy that intentionally contained a higher concentration of nickel and copper. But by current industry practices, the high concentrations of nickel and copper in the pipe elbow meant it was not fit for service in a process using hydrofluoric acid. Yet the pipe elbow remained in service for over 40 years.
Interesting. I initially thought maybe that there was some structural integrity because it was the elbow, it was the bend, but that's clearly not the case. It was the makeup of the pipe. This pipe had been in service for over 40 years, and this pipe would no longer be safe for this type of use, but there's no industry standard, and essentially this pipe was, for lack of better words, grandfathered in. Now, in the real world, when a lawsuit is going to be brought against this refinery company, I anticipate the refinery company is going to say, hey, listen, we didn't do anything wrong. This was not against any particular standard as described by the narrator. Well, just because you're not violating a standard doesn't necessarily mean that you're not negligent. If new and better and safer practices come out, even though they're not mandated, it is still your obligation as a good faith refinery owner, as an employer, as somebody who is charged with keeping people safe and not exposing the public to toxic chemicals, to follow the new best practices as they emerge.
Corroding at a much faster rate than adjacent piping components that did not have high concentrations of residual elements. The CSB also found that PES and the previous owner of the refinery never inspected all carbon steel piping circuit components susceptible to HF corrosion. Such a program was not required in the standards set by the American Petroleum Institute, or API, for the safe operation of hydrofluoric acid alkylation units. But had PES or the former owner inspected all of the carbon steel piping circuit components susceptible to HF corrosion in the unit, they may have identified that the pipe elbow was corroding at a faster rate than adjacent piping components, which could have prevented the incident.
So also there was no recent inspection.
After the incident, API revised its standard to include a new requirement for companies to develop a special emphasis inspection program to identify areas of accelerated corrosion in their refineries. By the CSB involves verifying the safety of equipment after changes to good practice guidance. When the pipe elbow was initially installed in 1973, the standard set by ASTM International for carbon steel piping did not specify limits on nickel or copper content. Over the next decades, that standard changed, and by 1995, the ASTM standard had been revised enough that the pipe elbow no longer met its requirements due to the elbow's high levels of nickel and copper. Yet neither PES nor
USCSB, hire me, baby. Actually, don't hire me. I like what I do, okay? I'm just saying, if my lawyer career fails, I'm going to work for the USCSB. For sure.
Or the previous refinery owner performed a comprehensive evaluation of all installed HF alkylation unit piping components manufactured to older versions of ASTM standards to ensure that the piping components were still safe to use.
To prevent catastrophic incidents, companies and industry trade groups must take swift action to ensure process safety when new knowledge on hazards is published. These actions must include ensuring that facilities built before the new knowledge was published are still safe to operate.
This could be an exhibit. Oh, yeah, I can't lie. I feel extremely validated right now. But do you know why I decided to bring up the common sense notion that refineries should keep up with new best practices as they emerge, and they shouldn't wait until some formal regulation gets passed to update their pipes or update their processes or things like that? Because we hear this excuse all the time. And I'm sure that's why the USCSB is bringing this up as well. Because we see this time and time again. People get injured, and the excuse from the corporation side is,
hey, we can't get in trouble. We were doing the bare minimum. You know, I haven't done this in a while. Bringing out the knowledge hammer.
Not to her. She's awesome. Right on point to the refinery. I'm sorry, refinery as a whole. This is symbolic of the corporation. All right.
A third safety issue discovered by the CSB concerns remotely operated emergency isolation valves. The largest of the three explosions at PES occurred when a vessel located above the failed pipe elbow violently ruptured. The CSB concluded that a jet flame shot from the ruptured pipe elbow and heated the bottom of the steel vessel, which contained a large amount of flammable hydrocarbons. For over 20 minutes, the jet flame erupted from the failed pipe elbow, weakening the steel bottom of the vessel and causing it to stretch and thin. The vessel then ruptured, launching 3 huge fragments into the air. The CSB found that there were no emergency isolation valves installed in the HF alkylation unit to remotely isolate nearby hydrocarbon sources that could then flow through the failed elbow. And these valves are not explicitly required by the current API standard.
Not explicitly required. Yo. Okay, I'm going now.
At PES, the HF alkylation unit was equipped with a water spray mitigation system that was a critical safeguard in the event of an HF release. The water mitigation system was designed to use cannons to spray large volumes of water at any HF release in order to suppress the amount of vaporized HF so that it could not travel off-site to neighboring communities. But when the control room operator tried to remotely turn on the water pumps that fed the water cannons, it was not possible because the control system communication to the water pumps as well as a backup power system in the unit had both failed during the initial fire. Although API recommends fireproofing these elements, it does not specifically require companies to do so.
It does not specifically require. Again, this is more along the lines, the bare minimum. Doing the bare minimum does not excuse you from your negligence. Here, to me, it's a negligent design. It's foreseeable that there's gonna be fire. Fireproof your damn mitigation services. Okay, now that the liability portion of this video is pretty much done and established, I wanna talk about the property damage aspect to this, which the USCSB does not cover. It's actually really, really interesting from a legal perspective. So let's just say you're in an urban area that's next to a refinery. The refinery explodes, it releases this toxic chemical. Well, obviously your first instinct is contamination, but what exactly is that worth? For instance, if this toxic chemical seeps into your house and it seeps into things like your curtains, your couches, your bed, that's not good. Obviously there's personal property damage that's gonna need to be at the very least cleaned, probably replaced. You don't want that stuff inside your house. It's gonna get into your air vents. Additionally, there's the medical monitoring component that we talked about earlier. But then the most tangible damage that I think people can relate and identify with is property damage. Let's just say your house is worth $100,000 pre-explosion. This explosion happens, it sets something off in people's minds saying, hey, maybe I don't wanna buy a house near a refinery. So suddenly the average property value goes from $100,000 to $70,000. That's a difference of $30,000 in tangible damage suffered by the homeowner as a result of this explosion. Now, there are some defenses to this on the refineries. For instance, if the refinery was there first, you could make the argument that, hey, these people chose to live next to the refinery, and obviously, as discussed before, it is foreseeable that a refinery is going to explode, and that very well might be a mitigating circumstance of this particular case. And while potentially a mitigating factor, it's definitely not an excuse. If a refinery is in the presence of any local living community, that means regulators have deemed it safe enough for those people to live there. And if people are deemed safe enough to live there, then yes, there is a duty by the refinery to not poison the people and contaminate their land. These particular claims that relate to the diminished value of real estate are called diminished value claims. A very interesting area of law that I have had to learn over the past couple of years. All right, y'all, that's it for today's video. Bye.
He's a catastrophic injury attorney who accidentally became a YouTuber. Attorney Tom.